Good afternoon. My name is Tara Hughes, and you are here today to listen to some planning information about how to integrate schools and school districts into a larger response to mass violence and domestic terrorism. There are three presenters here today. I am going to have each of the other presenters introduce themselves, and then I will come back and give some preliminary information about the webinar and the program, but I'm going to hand it off to Krista Flanagan right now so that she can introduce herself.
Great. Thank you, Tara. My name is Krista Flanagan, and I am a consultant with OVC, ICP, TTA, and it's a pleasure to be participating in this important webinar with you. I have experience in responding to a variety of incidents of mass violence, actually beginning in terrorism, beginning back with the Oklahoma City bombing in response to those trials, and then have responded to many more since then. My first school incident was the Columbine High School shooting, and then have responded with to other shootings around the country with schools, and have worked with communities and helping them plan and prepare a victim response to incidents of mass violence and terrorism. When I'm not doing this work, I am a teacher at Florida State University, College of Criminology and Criminal Justice, where I talk about mass violence and terrorism in addition to victim services. Thanks so much. Jason?
Hello, I'm Jason Dewar, and I'm also excited to be here. I've been in education for over 30 years in different capacities at the building, district, and state level. I've been a school counselor for the last 14 years, and I serve on our district mental health crisis response team. And I'm one of only a few trainers of our crisis prevention and intervention curriculum that we provide to our responders. I'm also a member of our community mental health crisis response team, and I'm a victim advocate for an organization that serves a handful of jurisdictions here in our metro area.
Thank you guys so much for introducing yourself. Again, my name is Tara Hughes. I am the project director for ICP TTA. The full name of the program is Improving Community Preparedness to Assist Victims of Mass Violence or Domestic Terrorism Training and Technical Assistance Program. We shortened it to ICP TTA because that's a lot easier. I have been at this job for about a year now. I have, by education and license, I am a clinical social worker and have been a trauma therapist for over 30 years. I got into responding to any disaster in 2001. Prior to 9/11, but it happened to coincide with the year. And I have started to sort of focus in on mass violence, domestic terrorism, and mass casualty responses since 2007. So I, like Krista, have had many responses over the years to very large events, but also many responses within schools. And we have, I have done major shootings, those kinds of things, but also done a significant number of suicides of students and teachers in school buildings and things like that. So we come to you today with lots of experience that we're hoping will be able to help use that experience to give you some information about preparing your school. And with that, we are actually all going to go off our cameras, and we are going to use just the PowerPoint so that you are able to see it a little more clearly. So let me tell you a little bit more about our program. Our program is what is bringing us to you today. And the goal of the program is really to augment existing emergency response plans in communities overall to include good, solid victim care. And part of that is to make sure that emergency managers who create and hold response plans in most communities or many communities are very connected to all of the stakeholders that are needed to respond to any of these mass violence or domestic terrorism responses. Schools are one of those key stakeholders. We are going to talk today about when things happen within schools, as well as when things happen outside of your schools in your communities, and how your schools can be integral in the good care of the victims. So We do this work within our program around these 16 best practices in planning. These are best practices that we have really come to from a lot of experience. There is not a lot of research around this, but we have a lot of subject matter experts that we have worked with to create these best practices in planning. And they cover everything that is needed really in both the immediate short term and the long term response to victims after one of these major incidents. You will see if you read through the 16 best practices that schools are not specifically called out in these 16 best practices, but you will find as we talk today that many of these will involve schools or can involve schools, again, depending on whether it's internal to the school or external. You may find that you have different tasks that you can be involved in. So we will revisit some of these throughout the entirety of our work today. And then at the end, we'll revisit and really just help you kind of get a frame around this stuff as we move forward. The only thing harder than explaining why we are preparing for these types of events is having to explain why we did not. When we think about planning, often people sort of downplay it and no, we don't need to do that. We know what we're doing. We'll be able to do this. But what we really need is to think about the connections that need to be made, the relationships that need to be made, and maintained, not just made, but and maintained. And that when we think about incidents of mass violence or domestic terrorism, there's a variety of types of incidences, and you need to really give yourself time to think and plan for any and all of them, because there will be differences, there'll be uniquenesses, there'll be nuances. So before we move into the actual goal of the seminar, what I want to really focus on is we know that schools prepare for something that happens within their walls. We know that there are plans written for that. Jason is here and he is on a crisis response team, and we know that those exist. Part of what we really want to do today is think more broadly in terms of how you could be helpful. And I want to talk about a couple of examples where we have seen schools being integral to the response, even though things didn't happen within a school. So the Garlic Festival happens in Gilroy, California, every summer. 2 years ago, there was a shooting at the Garlic Festival. That festival, the purpose of the festival is a fundraiser for youth serving agencies. And because of that, many of the high school students who need to graduate from Gilroy and the surrounding school districts do community service at the Garlic Festival. So at the time of the festival, they were 10 minutes prior to breakdown of the festival. And so there was an enormous number of high school students there to help with the breakdown. There were 10,000 people who were on the grounds at the time, and there are estimates that as many as 5,000 or 6,000 of them were school students overall, and a couple thousand were high school students. The schools have been integral to the response out there because that is where we're getting access to those kids and their parents and all of the people who are helping to take care of them throughout it, every day. So I'm going to call on Krista right now to talk a little bit about Oklahoma City and the Odessa Midland response for the same reasons.
Yeah, thank you, Tara. Yeah, very similar type of scenario related to how the schools were involved. That with the Oklahoma City bombing, that when that occurred, obviously it happened to a federal building, but it impacted an entire community. So actually the evening of the bombing, that there was on all of the local television channels, they were running a little banner at the bottom of the screen that was telling children if they were home and they were alone and they couldn't reach their parents, that there was a particular number that they should call. Because someone would come and get them, because most likely their children, those children that were home alone, had lost a parent or they were hospitalized. And the bombing happened in April, and then folks had the summer to access services. But the kids, when they started school in the fall, that we know that in a lot of elementary schools, they have the fire trucks that come to the school, and that's always a big exciting time. And a lot of the parents were struggling with, how do we tell our kids about this particular incident? And many of them, for younger children, would avoid this. So when the fire trucks were coming to the school, that while many of the kids did have that same sense of excitement, there were some that were very fearful. And because I don't know if you remember this, but one of the visuals, the common images that was spread around the country and around the world of that bombing was a firefighter who was holding a baby in his arms. And the baby was actually dying in his arms. And there was one little girl who, when the fire trucks came, she ran screaming and hid under her desk. And when they went and asked her what's wrong, and she said, well, that fireman killed that baby. And so the schools hadn't really thought of putting together a plan about how to deal with the trauma of the bombing that happened in April, because it wasn't a school event. And what they were seeing was that there were a lot of children that were really impacted by this, whether directly because they lost a parent or just because of it happening within their community. And in Midland, Odessa, that shooting it happened on a Saturday. It was a 12-mile strip of road where a man was shooting out of a car that he had stolen. It was a post office truck, and he actually ended up crashing into the parking lot of a movie theater. And there were the people, because they knew that this was happening, had been evacuated from the theater, so they're all standing out in the parking lot. And he fortunately didn't hurt anybody there, but ran in there or ran into the parking lot, and there were a lot of children that were in the movie theater that were impacted as well. So the school had to address this when coming back, on Monday after this incident occurred, and really saw a lot of behavioral health issues that they had to address over the following months.
Thanks, Krista. Again, I'm just going to say the only thing harder than explaining why we are preparing is to explain why we did not prepare. And I'm going to hand it back to Krista for a couple of definitions.
Thanks, Tara. And as Tara mentioned, that we're here to talk with you today about about putting a structure to the response that schools may already have, but then how the school structure can fit into a larger structure, because it's so important that we do that. And part of fitting into a larger plan is having common terminology. And so when we talk about mass violence and terrorism, that in your planning, that you want to make sure that you're coming off of the same definition. So when we think about mass violence, that the Office of Victims of Crime defines mass violence as an intentional violent act that results in physical, emotional, or psychological harm to a large number of people. And it's a predatory act that's planned and purposeful, and that they have an intended target, whether it's a person, place, or institution. Now, you'll notice that in this definition, you don't see fatalities as a requirement. Oftentimes, the FBI and its definition of mass violence is that they say that 4 or more people have died. That is not necessarily the case with OVC, that you can activate a response without there being any fatalities, because of looking at the psychological harm. A good example of this is an incident that happened in Virginia in a school, where there was a school that was actually held hostage. There had been an assembly that occurred, and a couple of gunmen came in and held the school hostage. Nobody ended up being killed, thank goodness, or even physically injured, but you had 1,000 students, and then there was faculty and staff that were traumatized significantly by that without there being a fatality. When we look at domestic terrorism, and domestic terrorism, really what we're looking at is sort of the difference of intent here, is that it's looking at acts that are intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, or influence a government by intimidation or coercion. It's really impacting a community or a system of government. A big difference when you're looking at mass violence is that sometimes, even though you know that there is an intended target, but we might not ever know the reason as to why. And so why is it important that we're even talking about these definitions? Well, there are a few reasons. One is that we have to look at the type of response it will be and who it is who's going to be in charge. If it's an incident of mass violence, it's possible that it's going to be local control. And if it is an incident of terrorism, it's going to be federal control. Now, even if it's an incident of mass violence, the FBI may show up because they have wonderful resources to support, but it would be following the chain of command of local police, local law enforcement, as opposed to the FBI. And that's just important so that you know kind of whose guidance it is that you are to be following. It also is important because you'll know what resources are available. So if it's a local incident that you might be looking at accessing more of the state and local resources, there would be some federal resources available. But if it's an act of terrorism, there definitely will be a lot of federal resources that will be available. Also, if there has been a declaration of disaster, whether at the state or national level too, will really influence the type of resources that would be available for a community in its response. Another reason that that it's important to think about these definitions is in your planning is about how you're going to define victims and when it is that you'll activate your response. Because when we look at the research related to mass violence, is that the vast majority of mass violence is domestic violence related. So that means there are families involved, and these can be, families of birth are also of choice, and this would also include gangs, and whether or not your plan is going to be activated with these types of incidents, that would be a discussion that would need to be had, and really what would that be related to what a school response would be if something were to happen in the school or out of the school, and knowing what kind of resources would be available to you in your community. Next slide, please.
Before you move on,
Yes,
just one
please.
thing. I realized that we're talking to a group of people who may not know what OVC stands for. So do you
Yes.
want to define
Thank
what
you.
that acronym is?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah, we do. It's funny in education everywhere we have all these different acronyms. It's interesting too because I've worked with schools and I've where you have LEA, which is your lead enforcer or lead education agency, and I was doing a project with them, and for me, LEA is law enforcement agency. So those acronyms are important. Thank you for that. So OVC stands for Office for Victims of Crime, and that is actually who is funding this project and who ICP TTA is under. So thanks, Tara.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a variety of phases of response to mass violence and terrorism. And because this is about planning, we want to start with a plan. And so hopefully, ideally that's the way it would be. And so, but you would have to start with your acute phase, and this is during the incident or in the immediate aftermath or up to the completion of the rescue. Also, this is where we would see an information notification center. And this is usually a location that is something spontaneous where families will be directed to go to get information essentially about where their loved ones are. Maybe they'll even get death notifications at this location as well. This is a hub of victim service resources for victims. And again, and it will be open. It's a spontaneous place. You can't really plan where that's going to be, but it is a location that usually Incident Command will determine, and it's open for a short period of time, 24, maybe 48 hours. Because then as you move into the transitional or intermediate phase, that's up to maybe the 1 year mark of the incident. Or if there's a prosecution of a case, that could be during that phase. And during this phase, there would be a family assistance center, which is once the information notification center shuts down, a family assistance center opens up. And this is sort of, for lack of a better term, sort of one-stop kind of resources, one-stop shopping kind of thing, there are all the resources under one roof for victims to go to, so that they don't have to go from agency to agency to agency. They're all there for them in one location. And they can be in places like churches or convention centers, maybe hotels, maybe stadiums, depending on the size scope of the incident. And family assistance centers are typically open no more than a week or so, if that. And then that should transition then into a longer term support, which is a community resiliency center. And this isn't where all the resources are in one spot, but there are navigators or victim advocates that work with victims to connect them to the appropriate services that they may need. And a lot of resiliency centers might provide some behavioral health support on site. And if there is a trial, there might be a hospitality center, which focuses on working with victims that are participating in the trial, whether it's to observe the trial or they are being called as witnesses. For long-term recovery, we're looking at like sort of the 18 months and beyond. And this is where we're looking at the appeals, parole hearings, penalty imposition. We're also looking at memorials and dedications. And we've left this next word in here for a teachable moment. So it says memorials, dedications, and anniversaries. You'll notice that up in intermediate, I have remembrance. So words matter. And what we have learned from victims over the years is that the word anniversary is kind of invalidates the marking or the commemoration of an incident of mass violence or terrorism. Anniversary usually has a connotation of something of a celebration. And so using a term like remembrance or 1 year mark or commemoration, et cetera, is much more trauma informed for victims. So during this long-term phase, this is oftentimes where you'll see a community resiliency center that will be open for maybe up to 3 years, and maybe your hospitality center, depending on a prosecution. And then we kind of wrap up with, looking at evaluation and assessment of a response. And that's something that's important in your pre-planning, before an incident, is that you want to have a mechanism that you can start to evaluate your response right away. And then you want to look at the results of your evaluation following an incident and then revisit your plan and see how you would modify that with your lessons learned. Now, here are the things that we recognize that every community and every incident is different, that there are unique aspects to it because you have, depending on who the population is that's impacted, what the community is and what the resources are, the makeup of the community, et cetera. But we also have learned that there are some commonalities in incidents of mass tragedy. And I just want to share a few of those with you. I mean, obviously there's multiple victims, but why that's significant is because you have mass trauma. And we have to recognize that everybody reacts to trauma very differently. And just because they have a shared incident does not mean that they're going to have a shared reaction. And so just being prepared for anything and everything. And also knowing that there are going to be a variety of agencies that are going to respond, because there's just no way that agencies in one community would be able to respond effectively. So we could be looking at multiple law enforcement agencies, multiple medical responses, coroners may be coming in from other jurisdictions, et cetera, but also looking at agencies that are not typically a part of a mass violence response. So this could be some of your business community that maybe either they have been impacted or that they are providing resources. And then obviously schools are a key component to the response. Good Samaritans, you're looking at government officials, politicians, et cetera, that are part of this multi-agency response because of normal agencies being overwhelmed. And as a result of this, that we see a high level of vicarious trauma with responders. Now, this is a couple of reasons. One is you have people that are trained in doing response, and they have an accumulation of their existing trauma that they deal with on a regular basis, but now all of a sudden they have hundreds, maybe thousands of new victims that they have to deal with. So responder vicarious trauma is real, and actually some recent research has shown that responders to incidents of mass violence are at a 30 to 50% increase of suffering from PTSD, as opposed to the general population, which is 10%, and then victims in general, crime victims and victims of mass violence is about 20%. So that they are at a higher risk. But also we look at responder, if we look at, that we're expanding our definition of responder, that you've got people that have never worked with victims at all. And so their rate of vicarious trauma is going to be pretty significant as well. And what vicarious trauma is that it's that secondary exposure to somebody else's trauma. And so having they impact, having those same reactions that victims are directly impacted will suffer just because of that exposure. And I know Jason is going to be talking about that a little bit later. Also, that what we know is that there's a lot of political response to this, that politicians come forward for a couple of reasons. One is that because they're being asked to, their constituents are saying, how come you let this happen in my community? How are you going to make sure that it doesn't happen again? And so there is a public calling for accountability. But let's also be real, is that politicians are going to use this as an opportunity to move forward their political agenda. And so they are going to utilize that platform. And we also have to recognize that politicians often are not trauma informed. And so they might be making promises that they are not able to keep just because they don't understand what the needs are of victims and what the services are that are provided. So this is an important piece to remember when you're putting together your plan, and we'll address this towards the end. Also recognizing, just to be aware, that copycat incidents are real. And that, especially in this day and age of our technology advancing with what it is, conspiracy theories as well. Another big piece that's important that we see in every incident, every mass tragedy, is the intense media coverage, and that looking at your plan about how you're going to deal with that, because they're going to be there, whether you want them to or not. And sometimes they're there before the responders are. And as a result of this intense media coverage, that we see a lot of community and vicarious trauma, or community and public vicarious trauma. So even though we have responders, now we have a community that has been subjected to this intense media coverage. And what do they want to do? What do they do to deal with that trauma? Is that they're going to write checks. They're going to maybe provide resources, and there's also going to be an outpouring of their emotions. So we're going to be seeing a lot of vigils, public memorial services, et cetera. And so how do you navigate that and manage that? Because that will occur. And also looking at some memorials that may be stood up, that would be those spontaneous memorials where people come and they leave mementos, teddy bears, et cetera. And then looking at maybe in the future that there might be a permanent memorial. And that's as a result of the trauma that communities are suffering from. And Tara is going to talk a little bit more about that.
So next, we get to look at what is truthfully my favorite depiction of what happens to individuals and communities after an incident of mass violence or domestic terrorism. I know it's a little odd to have a favorite graph, but it's kind of like having a favorite burner on your stove. You don't really talk about it, but it's there. So this graph, when you look at it, I want you to think about individuals. I want you to think about the community at large. And I also want you to think about your school community, because what we know is that this trajectory is unbelievably predictable after an event like this. And what we know when we're talking mass violence, domestic terrorism, we're really starting from that point of impact. So there's no warning, there's no threat. Sometimes there's threats, but they're often missed, or they're on the internet and they're, not responded to, those kinds of things. But generally, we are starting with that impact. And what we see are a couple of things. One is initially we have people come together and there's a lot of cohesion. There's people supporting each other. There are people helping each other, run away from the threat, or hugging each other when they get to a place, even if they don't know each other. We see a lot of that sort of honeymoon phase happening. And there is these types of incidents. It is as if you've taken a snow globe and shaken it as hard as you can, and everything gets thrown up in the air. And during that time when everything's up in the air, it feels like we need this cohesion to sort of hold ourselves together. What happens as things start to settle, and this is over time, as things start to settle, what we find is that reality tends to settle in. And that reality is often a pretty harsh reality, that no matter what services are there, no matter who's there to support you, any of those things, we've had awful things happen. People have died potentially, people have been injured. Our sense of the safety of the world has been taken away from us. All of those kinds of things feed into what's known as the disillusionment phase. And that's that very steep drop off after the honeymoon phase. And that is something that is predictable in every single one of the responses I've been to, Krista will say the same thing, that you get to a certain point where you want to start feeling better, and whatever's there isn't going to do that. That disillusionment phase can last for a fairly long period of time. You'll see that they have, in this graph, they have, it hits bottom and then it starts to go up a little bit, and the 1 year mark comes and it goes back down a little bit. The reality is that sometimes disillusionment lasts a lot longer than that, and it's still on the way down after a year. The timing of this is not something that we can predict necessarily. We can predict this will happen, but we can't predict the timing of it. What we can say is a couple of things. One, they're not straight lines. So you're going to get some ups and downs. You're going to have feel better one day, not feel great the next day, all of those kinds of things. The other thing that we can predict 100% is that the way that I might move through this is very different than the way Krista might move through this, or the way Jason might move through this, or the way you will move through it. Or frankly, if you have children, how your children will move through it. So you may be on an upswing some days, and people in your home, classroom, community may be on a downswing. And so there's a lot of disconnection that also feeds into that disillusionment stuff. The other thing that we know is that this is really hard. It's really hard to go through. And what we often see is that people learn things about themselves. They learn things about the community they're in. They learn things maybe about the school district that they are in. And they learn how to be more resilient in many ways. So if you look on the left-hand side where the impact is, and you draw a line all the way to the right side of the graph, you're going to see that that reconstruction line is much higher. And we often see that. It's called post-traumatic growth. And what that means is that we learn really hard lessons, but we learn about ourselves and the people around us. And this, I want to pause just a second and say that this is a graph that I use all the time. Again, favorite burner on the stove kind of thing. And this is really helpful with children. I was responding to a place in Alberta, Canada, called Slave Lake, and it's a small town. And one afternoon got surrounded by wildfires. They live in the forest, and they often have fires. And the fires are predictable, but how quickly these moved, and the fact that they all got trapped in this, 7,000 of them trapped in the town, was a little rough. They all evacuated. Nobody died, thankfully. I went up about a year later and was working in a school with a bunch of the classrooms, and a fourth grade student. I didn't have this graph, but I drew it on a piece of newsprint. So it didn't look pretty, but it had the basic shape. And I was talking about this, and a fourth grader raised his hand in the back, and he said, "I have an example of this." He said, I think this is what you're talking about. He said, when we came back from being evacuated, everybody was really, people that I didn't know were saying hi to me. And I walked into our pizza joint and I ordered one piece of pizza, and they gave me two just because everyone was being nice to each other. Now, a year later, I walk into the pizza place and I pay for my pizza, and it's like they don't even want to give me the one I paid for. And I said to him, I couldn't have explained this better if I tried. A fourth grader gets this, and using this and to understand what's happening with individuals, families, schools within a district, all of that is really, really important to think about. I am now going to hand it off to our school dude, Jason, and he is going to talk about what happens and how schools respond to things that actually happen within the school district or the school itself.
Thank you, Tara. Well, first, let me start by acknowledging NASP, the National Association of School Psychologists, and the Prepare curriculum. This is an evidence-based crisis prevention and intervention training curriculum developed by and for school crisis professionals. It's what we've adopted in our district, and I'm one of the trainers for that. And I think it's important to let you know where I'm coming from in a lot of what I'm going to be talking about. So I also want to acknowledge that I'm operating from a couple of basic assertions in regards to the role that schools play in crisis response. First is that children represent a highly vulnerable population whose symptoms and risk for psychological trauma are greater than adults and oftentimes have a lasting impact. Second is that schools are the center or the hub of our communities in many cases. And while not every crisis in a community happens in a school or is the usual range of school experience, the potential there to affect a large number of students and families is great. So please keep those in mind as we talk about all these things. So schools play a critical role in crisis response because, first of all, we provide one of the most important parts of mental health recovery by providing a safe haven. We're a place of typical safety, security, predictability, consistency, and it's a place where we connect with known support systems, teachers, and our peers. So we have the important opportunity to reaffirm physical health and perceptions of safety and security for our students and families. We have the established platforms to provide accurate and appropriate information. We have the opportunity to educate our community on elements of crisis situations that include developmental considerations and coping strategies. We have the unique ability to assess our student population to determine risk of psychological trauma and provide tiered supports and responses. And that obviously includes referrals to outside mental health services too when it's needed. And we can help identify families that may be displaced following a crisis and support their access to appropriate resources as well. And we also see our students and families over long periods of time, and that provides us with the ability to evaluate their recovery and growth, and of course continue to intervene if that's what's warranted. But I think perhaps above all, we really provide that sense of normalcy. So I want to highlight and expand on a few of the unique and important aspects of our role that we play. We have access that in many ways is really an extension of our families, especially if we're doing it right. We see our kids regularly. We provide a variety of educational activities and interventions. We can provide psychoeducational documents, psychoeducational groups, classroom meetings, and even caregiver trainings. And by partnering with other schools and districts, we can be collaborative in our planning and our response, and not to mention leveraging those, more resources and supports as well. We're able to evaluate for psychological trauma in real time and support families through the process, because we have that background knowledge. We have the familiarity of students and families, and I'll say usually. It's not always the case, but by and large, we have that. And that means that we can help families set and work towards appropriate goals, strategies, and recovery. And in schools in general, but especially in the secondary setting, students really are a significant part of each other's support system. I think it's important to make that distinction in the secondary schools, that being such a significant role in their recovery process. So, through a lot of challenges and experiences, this is not done without, in many cases, significant challenges and barriers. I'll tell you a quick story, and I do like the stories that Tara and Krista tell, because I just feel like these stories make all of this real and relatable, and not just, something that we're repeating or that sort of thing. So I think it's a good illustration to make it more relatable. And so the first day on the job in one of my district positions, and this position, I facilitated the mental health crisis response. And just to give you a little bit of background, it was summer, so schools were closed. the building and district resources obviously were very limited because folks were on vacation, including my team and my boss when this happened. So community superintendent came to me and said that there was an incident, and in this case, it was a student death. And he said, "You're on." And so while this wasn't my first crisis response, it was my first as the person leading the response in terms of our district response and how are we going to deal with, this happening, during the summer, limited resources, that sort of thing, communication, all of those things that come into play. Well, I luckily had access to a trusted colleague, and she told me, among other things, that her line, and I will always remember this because it's just, kind of where I started in this position. She said, "You know what, Jason, these things are messy and we will get through it." And so, and we did. But my lesson here is that we really can make things less messy if we are doing a good job with our planning and our preparation. And that certainly is what, we learned from that, is to continue to look at how we're planning and preparing and having systems that we go to in those situations, so a new person like me can just jump right in. So anyway, I wanted to share that with you and how we can, like I said, make it less messy. So things we can both expect and put some thought into in our planning process so that we can mitigate those challenges, right? It's important to acknowledge that some students are going to regress and to prepare for that. This could be behaviorally, it could be academically, and we'll see it in obvious ways. Sometimes, academic performance, but a lot of times it's more subtle. It might be attendance and they're not, coming to school, or it's behaviors at home that we're not seeing at school. I had a colleague that I worked with quite a bit in our crisis responses, and one of the things that he said, and I've always appreciated this too, is he said when we addressed school staff members, teachers, and that sort of thing, as we were, getting into our response and interventions and so forth, he said, learning may not be the most important thing that you do today. And this, I emphasize this because the importance of planning is so much that when a crisis does occur, we don't want our staff and our people to be seeing these things for the first time. So if they can be more familiar with, oh, this is what happens when this kind of thing occurs. And again, there's going to be unique differences and characteristics and so forth. But if we can practice some of this and think about some of this ahead of time, then it does help us be a little bit more effective in those moments. So, and even though, it is the norm to recover, this should be our basis for how we approach our response. There are going to be students that obviously have enduring signs of psychological trauma, and this is expected, but it also prompts us to intervene, within our multi-tiered set of supports. Also, our district calendars don't always cooperate, like I described in my story in regards to breaks and holidays, but it doesn't relieve us of our duty to students and families. And by the way, it can disrupt our testing too. So it's important to think about that and how we might be flexible in many events. I mean, just like even last year during the pandemic, different things, like in our state, we did not have our typical spring testing. So important to kind of think about those things ahead of time if we can. And like I said in the beginning, the only thing harder, or Tara said in the beginning, the only thing harder to explain than why we're doing this is having to explain why we didn't. And while I don't like operating on the assumption of a crisis being not a matter of if, but when, we do need to prepare. So we're increasing our knowledge, we're increasing our experience, and we continue to inform our practice. So, and while all crisis situations have their own set of unique characteristics, we can learn from other schools and communities and those experiences. And we sure have our fair share of crises in Colorado, unfortunately. But we also have a wealth of basic and critical foundational information and practices about how we intervene and respond to a mental health crisis. So we typically do a good job of circling the wagons immediately following a crisis event. It's important for us to have a plan for evaluating the effectiveness of our response. and the potential for ongoing needs and the potential for ongoing needs for resources and that sort of thing. It's our new normal, right? So it's part of what we have to continue to work with and work through in many cases. I just last year, I was part of a group of mental health folks that supported the 20-year gathering at Columbine. And like Krista referred to earlier, I call it gathering because in my conversations with victims and survivors, they lifted that up. They talked about how it's not an anniversary. It's not something that we want to remember in that way. So they called it a gathering, and that's what I called it. There was even some issue with victim and survivor terminology, but the important thing was that we were listening to those folks and making that a part of our planning to be there and support that particular day, when we had that gathering. So it's important to recognize the strengths and weaknesses of our preparedness and what we think, and I say what we think we're ready for. Oftentimes, I think we think we're ready for more than we actually are. So it can be a little bit humbling when we find that out, in a situation. But there's oftentimes a different perception of readiness between the school and between the district. I know I see that in my district where folks, in a building may not feel as confident as folks at the district that have done a lot more of this, sort of practice. And we have to expand our process of involvement and partnership so that we can expose our gaps and figure out where we need to continue to adjust and to learn. We're a pretty large school district. We have a lot of resources, and unfortunately, to some degree, and fortunately in others, we have a lot of experience. But a smaller district, more rural, that sort of thing, they might be very limited. So we have to think about how we can partner within our community to, other mental health services, maybe the victim advocacy groups, emergency management, other schools, our neighboring schools and districts, or BOCES. All of that to say, leveraging the knowledge and experience and resources of those around us, so that we can, continue to be effective in our response. And it has to be a part of our planning so that we are, considering what those needs are going into it. So one of our most common challenges as educators, including teachers, mental health professionals, support staff, administrators, is that in our determination to take care of everybody else, we often neglect ourselves. And while that might be admirable, it's not effective as we move through this recovery process, certainly in the short term and certainly in the long term. So it's important for us to plan for that and to remember that many times it's our educators who are also experiencing trauma as a result of an incident. And their capacity to be effective may be compromised. So we need to be prepared to step in and, we call it tap someone out if necessary, and just recognize where we may need to, provide some additional help. So if we're planning effectively, this is an expectation rather than a surprise or a conflict. This is something we talk about so people know that this is part of our process, and that might be too when we relieve someone of their response because they've, we want to, consider the number of days or have breaks between days and that sort of thing, because it may go on for a longer period of time. So, this is why, and I'll just tell you quickly, this particular issue is why we move to a staff contact plan when something happens, when folks are around. So, for instance, an incident occurs, there's a crisis. We used to have phone trees, or there would be an email that notified everybody of this. But that didn't account for the things that we might not know about our staff and their emotional health or proximity to a victim even. So this was a task that we divided amongst the leadership team responding to a crisis situation so that we address some of those things that, our professionals may be experiencing. We also struggled to engage some of our families and community members in the process. And this can really be for a number of reasons. but it really emphasizes the need for our schools to be positive and welcoming environments, first and foremost, and also to think about strategies that we'll use to engage those families that are not necessarily, responding to what we're providing. Communication plans are also essential, especially as it pertains to an initial response to a situation and how this might differ in different incidents. Ongoing information updates and how to handle inquiries from the public and the media are important things to consider. We also have to, we talked about language before and the words that we're using. We used to say reunification. Now we're saying information notification because we know that some of the students may not be reunited with their families. So it's important for us to have a plan for these kind of things, for things like death notifications and other sensitive issues that require balancing that privacy, with the needs of our students, victims and survivors. And in our district, we're large enough to have a communications team, a public information officer that handles all of this with our leadership, but not all districts have that. So ultimately, we're trying to get back to the business of educating our students, return to pre-crisis levels of functioning, and while we know recovery is the norm, some students will still need more, and a few will need even more. So as we observe, the crisis reactions and gauge the impact, we have to balance the needs of all students. We know not everybody needs the same thing, and nor did they have the same experience. So with effective planning for our response, we include that psychological triage and assessment, and of course, matching the need with the appropriate intervention.
Excellent. Thank you for all of that, Jason. So we're going to talk about some considerations for the response overall, understanding that there are some things that are unique to students and schools that, again, whether something happens in the school or out of the school, these are things to think about. We want to make sure that there are as many open doors as possible. Jason just talked about families that might be harder to reach or that aren't responding to what you're putting out in terms of support or options or information. And so thinking about as many open doors as possible, as many ways for people to get brought in and be given some of this information. So thinking about support groups for students, for staff, for families, for having people come in from the outside to help with those support services, victim compensation, victim advocates, other resources that are out in the community. If it is a crime, if it's mass violence or domestic terrorism, and it is a crime, then everyone who is a victim is eligible for victim compensation and victim advocacy services. So making sure that the school is facilitating that, even though they're from the outside, that's really important. We often talk about having educational forums where after an event like this, parents will often not ever come for help for themselves, but what they will come to is an educational forum to learn how this is going to impact their children. And what we know about those forums is that we may be talking about their children, but we're also talking about them and how they're reacting. And so really coming up with ways to bring them in. So they're not coming for help, they're just coming to learn so that they can help the students. And that's really important. Teachers may fit that same category. You can have an educational forum where you teach teachers what's going to happen with their students. And by virtue of being there, they learn some about what's happening with themselves. Inviting mental health professionals in from the outside for an extended period of time. This is often a challenge for districts to open their doors in this way. A lot more schools these days across the country have mental health school partnerships, which increases the possibility of this. And so taking advantage of that and understanding that this is not a sprint, that this is a long-term process. So keeping those mental health professionals available to the students and to your faculty and staff as long as possible is really important. And then thinking about students, thinking about the seniors who are going off to college and are going to need support. So something happens in April of their senior year. Um, they are going to move away potentially to go to college and not have all of the supports of the community. So thinking about that in terms of planning, long-term planning, thinking about things that happen on school breaks, on holidays, students who don't return. So if something happens in your school, a lot of times we see families pull children from schools because their children don't want to go back to those schools. So they transfer and they go somewhere else, whether the family moves or not. They may go to a private school or from a private school to a public school. And it's really about making sure that there's a plan that will outreach to all of those students and families. There was a shooting in Rigby, Idaho in May of this year, and they had over the summer realized that there was a huge drop off in the number of students enrolled in the public schools. And when they came back, that drop was, I believe, last I heard, was 28% of the student body did not return. They went to other schools privately in the area. Some actually are now paying to go to a different public school in a different district. So it's important to have a plan that covers all of those students. And then again, thinking about the students, and Jason talked about this a long time ago, especially in secondary education, creating opportunities for students to be with each other, to process and to support each other, because that is incredibly important for them um, to get that support from each other, because that's where they're getting it about everything else in their life at the moment. So we need to help mimic that. When we think about now shifting to something happens in the community. So up to this point, we've really been talking about things that have happened in the schools and sort of generically what would happen. But if you have something that happens in the community, what's the impact on the schools? And there are lots of things which are pretty, if you think about them, they make a whole lot of sense. This idea that families and students will be impacted, some directly by this incident, whatever the incident is that happened outside of the school. And so understanding that you have potentially direct victims, those are people who are directly impacted or were there when it happened, and you have indirect victims, people who love and care for direct victims. So let's say during the school day, something happens at a bank in the community and there are parents in that bank. The kids you have in your class would be secondary victims to those parents. They weren't there, but they're dealing with those parents every day. And now you're dealing with the students every day. So you want to think about lots of things about how this is going to impact your school, size and scope of what happened, who was targeted. Was it a targeted kind of a thing, or was it random? Was there a particular race, ethnicity, class of people that have been impacted or directly impacted? Thinking about how that's going to impact your school body, students, parents, faculty, staff, all of that. And then thinking about how the changes that happen in the community are going to impact students. So a lot of times you can't change the result of what happened. You can't change the fact that there was a shooting or something like that. But what students and families are now having to deal with are the changes that have happened in the community, some positive, some negative. Krista talked about the media onslaught. That's something that's very overwhelming to people. Sometimes there's an increase in law enforcement presence. And there are some people who find that comforting and some people who find that the opposite of comforting. So thinking about what are the changes that are happening in the community is a really important component of this. And often the question that you want to ask in your schools is, the outcome of this is obviously a huge change. You know, people died in the community or whatever. But if you could sort of take that out of the picture and figure out what's the biggest change that you have had to deal with as a student, Tell me about that. And often it's they can't go out by themselves. Their parents aren't happy letting them go to soccer practice anymore. They can't hang out in certain neighborhoods, whatever it is. But what that gets to is the depth of changes with the way the community is functioning. And that's what you will be dealing with in the schools. When we think about resiliency factors, I'm just going to remind you, or when you look at this, what you're seeing are the same resiliency factors that were noted before. So if something happens in the school, all of these things were true. If something happens outside of the school, it is going to impact students and the school in many ways. And the resiliency factors are going to be the same things that we look to. It's about relationships. It's about teaching people what they're going through. What does trauma do to the brain? It's an easy thing to talk about if you know what you're talking about. And what you need to do is find people who know what they're talking about and bring them in. Very young children can learn about how their brain is functioning differently. What that allows is for people not to blame themselves for sort of being broken by a certain event, but allows themselves the grace, for lack of a better word, to understand that they're reacting in a very predictable way. So, looking at resiliency factors, you're going to see the same things as you are if it happens in the school, as if it happens in the community. In terms of what happens and why it's complicated, if it happens outside of the school, there are a couple of things that we're really going to look at. You may have more reaction in the larger community, more activation of past trauma in parents or people who aren't even connected to the school. If it happened in the community, you are going to have potentially pre-existing or ongoing community violence that doesn't get the attention that this mass violence event gets. And that has caused, in any number of circumstances, that causes a lot of tension. Why are you getting an infusion of money on, and all these services are coming to help you, and all this other stuff happens that's pre-existing and maybe ongoing, and we don't get anything? So you may get a lot of that sort of complicated reaction to what's going on. You may be in a position where there aren't many services. Jason talked about this before. Some rural areas, it's much more challenging to find the services. But frankly, in a lot of big communities, sometimes the services are just tapped out, and they're not. There's waiting lists that are really long, or you don't feel comfortable going to a certain agency because that agency, and you worked with that agency previously or something like that. I think one of the big things that we see, and again, Krista and I can both attest to this, and Jason, I'm sure, can attest within schools and with other responses that he has had, that there is often a denial that this impacted us. Sure, this happened, but we're ready. We're done. We're done with that. We finished that. We're just going to move on. And there's a piece of that that makes sense because it's easier just to go back to the way it used to be. But the reality is you can't do that. And that when you deny the impact, what you end up doing, excuse me, what you end up doing is denying the trauma that people are feeling and denying the emotions that they are feeling. And so doing that really creates a much broader complication in the response. And again, when you look at what do we need to consider, this is for outside of the response. I'm sorry, outside of the school district or the school, something has happened. So looking at still increasing behavioral health within the schools because students, families are going to be impacted. Thinking about using the venue, your venues, gymnasiums, auditoriums, things like that for community gatherings of some dimension. And then really thinking about building partnerships between outside agencies and the school to actively plan for this kind of a thing. Consider that sort of as a first and foremost thing that you really, really want to focus on. And with that, I'm actually going to hand it back to Jason, and he's going to talk about some of the best practices in terms of responding within schools, both to things that happen there and outside of the schools. So Jason, you're on.
All right. So let me preface this with, excuse me, best practices being a combination of experience and evidence-based curriculum like Prepare. Okay. So for many of us in education, I would say we don't recognize the opportunities for growth in our preparedness until something happens. There's a boxing quote that says everybody's got a plan until you get punched in the face. And, when we see it when it's been exposed, right? And I found the important thing is to intentionally keep working wherever you are, wherever we're at, keep working, keep growing and learning and go from there. Because, if we all take a look at it, we've all got, things in place that we feel confident about. There's areas we may not know about as much, and just things that we just don't know that we don't know. So that's why we want to, get into this in depth and, develop that team with the specific focus of how we're going to support mental health crisis response and recovery. Consider a curriculum like Prepare and NASP. And then, devise your plan for how you're going to train your mental health responders. However it needs to look, start small, start big, whatever makes sense in your area, but be intentional and start or continue if you have started. I know for us, when we got introduced to Prepare, we made that a requirement of induction for all of our mental health professionals coming into the district. We've since found out that might not be the best way in terms of some of the complications that have been created as a result of it. But we're still utilizing that curriculum, and we're still training our responders and our mental health professionals so that we are more prepared when these situations arise. Consider your partnerships. We've talked a little bit about this. Those partnerships in the community, emergency management, mental health professionals, victim advocates, other schools, districts, and so on. We have something we call a Metro Crisis Team here. It is, about a handful of schools in our metro area that get together, a couple of people from each of the teams from those districts, and we get together and we talk about what we're seeing in our districts, our practices, our training, and how we're just responding to different situations and what we can learn from each other. So I think that can be a really important part too. Think about the things that also make your district great or strong. Consider partnerships in the community, like we've talked a little bit about before, emergency management, mental health professionals, victim advocates, other school districts, and that sort of thing. We have a Metro Crisis Team in our area that there's a handful of schools in our area that representatives of those crisis teams from those districts, we all get together and just talk about what's working, what's not working, what are we seeing, how did a particular response go, what are some of our practices, what are some of our forms and documents, that sort of thing. And that can be just really important to again, leveraging those other folks. Consider what you already have in place. Consider what you have in regards to multi-tiered interventions, what you may be lacking. How is your process for assessment and triage in a particular crisis incident? What about referring to outside resources? What does that look like? What kinds of things are already set up, and how do we vet those, those folks? But in the end, I think too, just always be willing to evaluate for your effectiveness in all aspects of your response. I think a lot of times we miss that, or we don't do it as well, or we don't have a good structured process to make sure that we're learning from these events and, the things we did good, like I said, and those mistakes. Recognize that it's important to educate and train caregivers, both before and after a crisis incident. And when I say caregivers, I'm talking about educators and our parents and guardians. And Tara brought this up, maybe they don't want to come for themselves, but they'll come because they want to learn more about how to support their child, their student. Recognize that in most cases, and especially early on, the single most important initial thing that we can do as part of a crisis response is to reestablish support systems, reunite those students with families and caregivers, and otherwise affirm physical health and safety. That's one of the most important things that we can do in a response, especially initially. Remember that in larger events, schools are operating within the structure of a larger response, and that our cooperation, our expertise, our experience, that's all critical to the process as a whole and how effective we are in our collective effort, right? And with that, we have to consider our role within those command structures, ICS, NIMS, Unified Command, and the work that we put into that the work that we put into those relationships and partnerships with those individuals from, other districts or other municipalities or individuals within those municipalities that, maybe it's the police chief or whatever. Those different relationships and partnerships pay off when these events occur, and we're more familiar with each other as we work through it. We set up a large drill. It had over 100 actors in it. It had multiple jurisdictions, and so there were lots of people coming from different angles. And what was magnified for me was that it does get messy, and this is why we have to practice. And this also goes back to just, again, having that familiarity, walking through some of those processes, so it's not the first time we're seeing it when it happens for real, right? And you'll hear some repeating of certain things, but I think it's important to lift some of these things up again. So that communication plan is so important for all the schools in the district. But I want you to consider too charter schools and what they may not typically be a part of that district plan. We've seen in different situations that it makes sense for these plans and these safety practices. It makes a lot of sense for us to be on the same page, so that information is accurate, timely, appropriate, and we're all receiving the same information. It's consistent, and we're all able to be on the same page. I do have an example of just a communication that occurred with me that caused us to change our behavior, our practices. I was given the responsibility of informing a group of teachers that one of their students had died by suicide, and so I sat down with that group of teachers and we had that conversation. And about an hour later, I was told that the student didn't actually die. And as you can imagine, the different issues related to that, the thing that we took from that and what we learned from that is that we have a specific person that connects with the coroner that verifies a death before any kind of communication, talking points, or anything like that is put forward. So again, that can be humbling, and it was certainly humbling for me. It wasn't my fault. It wasn't something that I set up, but I was the person that ended up having that experience, and because of that, we've made our practices better. So, to continue, accessing or access to appropriate resources and partnerships help us with the updated information, making sure that information is accurate. And having those relationships beforehand, they're already formed. Again, that just makes a huge difference when we need that support in that moment, right? So also trained mental health teams with an emphasis on trauma-informed practices so that we're sensitive to the needs of our students and families. In regards to those partnerships, I want to give you a couple of examples of that. We have found that our relationship with our local victim advocates has been invaluable. We both learn from each other and we cross-train. So we'll partner in training in terms of what kind of training, the people that we get to speak, and make sure that we're all able to benefit from that. And then also, those victim advocates have strong ties in the community in general, so they become a large part of our community response when we have an incident. Another relationship that we have is an organization called Second Wind, and that was formed following a cluster of student suicides, and they provide timely suicide-specific counseling. So suicide-specific counseling at no charge with vetted mental health professionals, and we pretty much make it quick or immediate access. And so that's what we're able to do with that group. So those relationships we're able to do a lot of things that we wouldn't be able to do if we didn't, make those contacts. But to continue, it's always important to know our students, our families, and communities so that we're sensitive to the different cultural differences, developmental issues related to mental health and personal growth. And in this planning phase, be sure to consider what data you need, what you feel like will guide your decision making regarding student supports, what growth indicators you're looking for, so that you're informed and that you can continue to plan, to implement, and to adjust as you go along.
So, Jason, I'm going to jump in here just to tell something that I think really drives a number of these points home. When I responded to the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting, and the students were all taken to a local firehouse, and that was where they were brought back together with their families. And all of the families were sitting there. As that was going on, there were 20 young children who had died. And those families were all mixed in with everybody else in the room. At about 4 o'clock on the day of the shooting, the governor walked in, and he had been there in the building for a while. And he walked into the room and said to the 20 families that were sitting there, well, if you don't have your children back, I guess you can guess that you're not going to get them back. And that was essentially their first death notification. What that said to me in the moment, when I kept trying to pull his words back in, which is not possible, is that if we had had a plan, if there had been a plan about who gives that information, how it's done, how families may be separated if you have names of students, or if you don't, how are you going to manage this type of situation in a trauma-informed way, then that planning would have kicked in. And instead, in a very non-trauma informed way, these families got a the most challenging information they'd ever gotten, the most horrifying information they'd ever gotten. I think the other thing it points to is the fact that we talked about this way at the beginning. Politicians are going to show up. Krista talked about they have a number of reasons for doing that, but they're going to show up and they're going to want to do things when they are there. And if we have a plan that helps direct them appropriately, and we have a plan that helps to think about notifications, whether they're death notifications or bringing notification of injury, of admission to a hospital, whatever it might be, that planning is key. Because if there was planning, that would never have happened with the governor. So I will send it back to you.
Agreed. And I'm going to lift up it's a point that I'm going to make here in a couple of minutes. And you can see it on the page now, is that mental health is a part of the structure within the command structure, ICS and NIMS. Because if we're doing that, if those folks, and I mean at the building level also, it is a part of the structure in terms of when you look at what the structure is, but those folks are not always lifted up in that practice, especially at the building level. I do see it more at the district level and that sort of thing. But I think if we are inserting those mental health professionals and making sure that we are all part of that, that structure, I think that we are going to do better at both the planning and the avoidance of that kind of thing. So I think that's a great illustration of those points. So it is important as we look at our best practices to provide appropriate briefing and debriefing. That can also help with some of that information being shared, in the right way and at the right time and that sort of thing. But with the groups, our response team, our staff, our families, and our communities, and obviously it varies among the different stakeholders, in terms of what we're debriefing, how we're debriefing, and what is confidential and what is shared publicly. And that can be tricky. I just want to point that out, that, while we want to maintain consistent messaging and that sort of thing, there are things sometimes, especially on these response teams, that there are things that we're going to know that's not part of that messaging. It's just important to be able to recognize those differences and maintain that confidentiality, and also contribute to what people need to know as well that's appropriate. So anyway, these debriefings, they allow us to hear that, the collective needs, the concerns of stakeholders, to assess ongoing needs, to determine, what kind of adjustments do we want to make if we're in a multi-day response. What do we want to do differently? What do we, I've been in a situation where, like I said, we had that Metro crisis team. We share documents. And one of the documents that was shared talked about another event. And in our process of reviewing what we were doing in that particular intervention on that particular day, we saw, before anybody else did, so that was good, but we saw that one document referred to a previous event. And so we were able to pull all of those before anybody else saw them. So in our efforts to support one another and leverage resources and that sort of thing, we almost made a big oops in that regard, in terms of, just sharing something that just wasn't appropriate for that particular time. But, also with these debriefings, it's also an opportunity to hear positive messages, messages of hope, health, and strength that exist in these, incidents and within the community and among our students and families. So that can also occur. And I think that's an important piece to remember, because obviously we're dealing with a lot of trauma. And in that, there can be some things that we can lift up and feel good about too. So, and like I said before, keep in mind that recovery is the norm for most individuals. The event alone does not fully indicate or represent all crisis reactions. And, knowing that, crisis reactions are common reactions in most cases to a very uncommon event. So it's not necessarily an indication of mental illness. So we just need to, make that distinction. And in our planning efforts, it's important to emphasize this role of, like I said, this role of the mental health and the command and leadership structure. And again, I'll just emphasize with that I see that more kind of at that building level, but it does, it has created an issue that we've been trying to address. It's important to understand the roles that schools have in events that happen outside of our schools, the roles that we have in events that happen outside of our schools, the consequences, the school-related consequences that can occur as a result of that. And again, remembering that just because something happens when our school is out or on vacation or break doesn't mean that we don't have a role in that recovery process. Recognizing the difference between that initial crisis reaction, that crisis state, and when students demonstrate or exhibit enduring warning signs that indicate, that development of mental illness, or it could also be the exacerbation of a mental illness that's pre-existing. And finally, having the mental health professionals that are properly trained to conduct effective psychological triage and assessment, and also obviously have the ability to match the identified need with the appropriate intervention and the appropriate level of intervention. So I found that we're always learning in this arena. It's humbling much of the time, or can be, and it's just important to have a growth mindset in our planning and adjustments so we can continue to meet those moments when they occur.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to shift gears a little bit and start to talk more about planning in general and the considerations that you want to think about as you're putting together your plan, and then the plan itself. So schools really must have, as Jason's talked about quite a bit, must have crisis plans and teams in place that encompass preparedness, prevention, interventions, response and recovery, both short and long term, and an ability to examine how the process is going to ensure appropriate in the time and also in the future adjustments and learning. School safety and crisis teams also really should be adequately trained in terms of the types of crisis systems and procedures and the unique mental health needs that can arise as a result of a crisis. And Jason really spoke about this, and these plans really should be fully integrated in the larger community emergency response efforts, including public safety, fire rescue, community health, et cetera, and making sure that it's communicated well to the staff, to the parents, and community leaders. Other planning considerations, and this goes back to really where we started, is really looking at those 16 best practices that Tara opened with and looking at all of those components. And I know when people look at that and they think about, how comprehensive a plan has to be, that it can be overwhelming. And really what we encourage communities to do is to just take one of those components at a time and figure out what your role would be. And a really good place for schools to start would be to say, find out what's already in existence within your community and where would you fit. And going to maybe your emergency manager or finding out within your local community, where does your incident command response plan live, and are schools a part of that? And finding out then how that could be expanded, looking at beyond the actual acute phase, because communities are pretty well equipped in that acute phase that we spoke about earlier. But what happens after that? That's where we kind of fall short. I think in most communities would agree. And so, like I said, coordinating with that emergency management. And really, it's so important to maintain flexibility and coordination that even though we spoke about those established factors, there are things that you cannot predict or plan for. And as it was famously said, you can't plan for everything or you'd never get started in the first place. So planning can otherwise really be overwhelming. I mean, looking at those 16 best practices, like, oh my gosh, that's really overwhelming. But you have to be able to allow for flexibility and recognize that you cannot plan for everything and it's okay. You just want to provide a structure that can be able to predict for the reactions that we know, what is it that we know, and know that we don't know everything. And also, though, that you need to consider that you want to be able to incorporate those predictable reactions of those high levels of stress that Jason spoke about into the daily school functioning. So, how's this going to fit with your announcements and paperwork that goes home, emails that go out? And those are things you can plan ahead. You can plan that messaging ahead of time. Tara, do you want to continue to talk about planning considerations?
There's a couple of things that I want to focus on this slide. When we think about incident command structure, so ICS is incident command structure. I'm not sure we defined that yet. And NIMS is the National Incident Management System. So those are two systems that really create the structure that emergency responders and emergency management and first responders use. They all function under that same structure. And so when we're talking about getting people trained, what we want is for people in schools to understand that structure, because there are places where they will fit into that structure, and there will be people who they need to report to within that structure. And understanding how the structure works is going to help overall for everybody's response. So thinking about getting that training for all personnel, including leadership. So when we talk about leadership, we're talking about superintendents down through, principals, vice principals, leaders within the schools, so that people understand what is going to be happening and what the structures are. Also, just understanding the basics of mass violence response. A lot of what we're talking about today, how to lead in something like this, is understanding what you need to do and being able to put that into action. Figuring out how do you communicate. Lots of what we've talked about in the last 20 minutes is about communication and messaging. Getting training in that early. Very, very important. Understanding that behavioral health providers are often incredibly well trained, but there are specifics about mass violence, about this type of event, that's really helpful for them to know, to add to their well of information that they pull on to work with kids and families. And then understanding that most school districts have an EAP for their staff, and that EAP, if it is going to be responding, should be trained in mass violence response. They should understand this as a very sort of specific type of response, because it is not their norm. And so it's important to do that. Thinking about, again, a number of just highlights on this slide. thinking about both the commonalities and the differences when you are looking at how to respond and what your school can give to a response like this. Understanding the unique factors that you come with as a school, but also who is in your school, what culturally and developmental variety do you have in the school? If you're in a district, you're going to be dealing with K or pre-K through 12, and as we spoke earlier, even beyond that, to help protect those students who are leaving. So thinking about developmentally what needs to happen in different schools and with different groups of people, but then also culturally. Where do different cultures meet? Who do they see as their community leaders? How do they interact with the school on a regular basis? Those kinds of things. All of that is really important to think about in terms of planning and in terms of really pulling this together. I'm actually going to turn it back to Jason to talk about what schools have on hand already that they can use in terms of resources and communication strategies and all of that kind of thing.
So, and in many, like Tara said, things that schools already have. What are we doing well? What are areas that we need to improve? What are, some things that we need to think about? And a lot of times we need to go through a particular process that helps us continue to evaluate, like, hey, we don't have a great system for, a targeted system, for instance, that's addressing, something within a particular group or whatever, so taking a look at those things, but in many cases, these are things that we're doing. These are things that are in place, and we just need to lift them up, expand them, improve them, and whatever. So, starting with kind of the building block is that the importance of having that welcoming school, that school culture, that strong, positive culture in our buildings. Again, foundation for really everything. School-wide positive behavior support structures. These are the framework for which we achieve, different identified social and academic outcomes in our buildings. So that's the framework. And within that framework, it's important to have strategies and resources for everyone. So here's that multi-tiered approach. You got resources for everyone, additional for some, and even more for the few that demonstrate that need. Social emotional learning has been around for a long time, but has gotten some new, some new energy. But it fits in within that framework too, as a practice that supports student behavior, right? And while staffing issues can be a concern, having adequate mental health supports in our schools, it might require something outside of, some outside support. We've talked about that and the significance of having those pre-established relationships. So looking at how we're addressing those mental health needs. We've certainly learned that there are a number of things we can do to improve the physical safety of our buildings. And conducting a vulnerability assessment is one thing that you can do to kind of look at some gaps or areas of weakness and other areas that you might need to plan for. But that's something that we've been doing a much better job with as well. And finally, it's critical to have a robust threat assessment process so that we're more effective at preventing those internal threats that we usually have more information about and more control on how we're going to handle them moving forward. So really taking a look at that process as well.
So where to from here? Now it's time to talk about actually creating the victim response plan and what that would look like. And we want to focus on looking at the intermediate and longer term phases. Now, partnerships and planning, and this has been mentioned a couple of times today, but this is through our presentation. It's critical. Dwight Eisenhower had said that in planning for battle, I have always found that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. And the reason that he says that is because part of the plan, the big key to planning itself are partnerships and planning. That because these partnerships and planning, that they are paramount to the success of an effective response. Partnerships require an ongoing attention to the myriad of issues that are related to collaboration and coordination of resources that are necessary to meet the immediate and longer term needs of victims and the community at large. It's essential to community readiness to make sure that everybody, that all the partners are at the table and that they're valued, and really focusing on that victim assistance strategy and not so much on the agencies, but the victim assistance component itself. And what this means is making sure that the victim response plan is comprehensive. We use the word collaboration a lot. And I don't know that we always use it correctly, but true collaboration is working for the mutual benefit of each other with a common goal. And ultimately, the common goal of a victim response plan is that it's victim focused and meeting the needs of victims. But it also has to be multidisciplinary, and it needs to recognize the value of each of the entities, and remembering that there are going to be new entities sitting at a table if you're looking at a comprehensive plan, and learning about each other and doing the cross training and that Jason had mentioned earlier, that we learn about each other and recognize the value that everybody sitting at that table can offer. And that means respecting the needs of each other and, again, remaining victim focused. And with being victim focused, it's recognizing what the victim's needs are. So looking at those core basic needs, especially immediately following the incident, that we're looking at, food, clothing, shelter, safety, et cetera. But then as time goes on, what's the evolution of those needs and how are they changing? That can be, that ongoing information and support and referrals. And if there's a trial, that there could be criminal justice support, but really, and having that shared communication amongst the multi-disciplines. The media management is key to a victim response plan because we've spoken about with these incidents, the media is going to be there. Number one, it's a mass tragedy. Number two, it's impacting the youth or the youth that will be affected because of the incident. Crime victim compensation that Tara spoke about earlier, that's critical because whenever you have a victimization, that crime victim compensation resources will be available, and recognizing what benefits they can be, but also what their limitations are so that you know what other needs might be necessary. And also donation management is a really key component because when an incident occurs that people want to help, and that goes back to that public vicarious trauma that, that can be discussed and that we've talked about before, that people want to help. And Americans are generous. And so they are going to be showing up with goods, services, and money. And so what do you do with those, and knowing how to manage those ahead of time? That's a key as a part of your planning. Recognizing about the memorials and remembrances that we've spoken about. And ultimately, what your plan needs to be looking at, one of the big goals is maintaining the integrity of the school and the community, that your school isn't identified with just an incident that's happened, or your community isn't just where a horrific incident has occurred. That is integrated into part of who the community is, or maybe part of who the school is, but that is not how they are identified. Tara, do you want to circle us back around to the 16 best practices are part of a victim response plan?
Sure. Thanks, Krista. So yes, I just wanted to put this back up there quickly so that you guys can now you have lots of information that you can sort of put into this chart and see how many different time periods schools can be vital to the response, to the victim response, because you are going to have access to victims, and you being seated in incident command structure training, knowing your partners are going to be able to be integral in all of the things that happen after that. So just wanted to put this up really quickly. And now just to kind of circle us home again, the idea of planning is really bringing the future into the present so that we can do something about it now. So we're really looking at pulling this together and doing it now so that we have a better chance of doing it well when it actually happens. We have a couple of resources for you. One is This training is one of a number of recorded trainings, and they are on the website for the program. One of the things that we have available to you is if you have watched this and think you want additional information or would like to customize this to your community. So you as schools want to get involved in your emergency management response, you can call us, you can email us, you can contact us any way you want to, and we can link you with one of our subject matter experts, Krista, Jason, mostly, to come and help you actually customize this to your community, to your school district. So that is available to you. What is all, and that if you go to icptta.com, you will have access to our contact information. There's a link there. You can contact us directly. You can also just email us at icptta@icf.com. The QR code that is on your screen right now is actually to the application for your full community to link with the program. So that would mean that you as a school district would link with your emergency manager and say, everybody together is really committed to this, or we want to get people committed to this, and we want to apply to get subject matter experts to come in and help us do this for our community. So if you just hold your phone up to that QR code, it will take you directly to that application. And finally, we have our contact information. So each of us has our email and a phone up there, and you are welcome to contact any of us. Any of us can also get you linked with the program if you didn't copy down that number. But that's all we have today. So I will take this opportunity to thank the subject matter experts on the call, Krista and Jason, and hope that you have gotten a ton of information and that you will figure out ways to operationalize this and put this into your schools and your communities. We think it is essential to a really well-rounded response. So we thank you for paying attention for as long as you have, and we hope to hear from you. Thank you.